Last week, tons of influencers and media were flown out to play Hogwarts Legacy early. Those previews and impressions went up earlier this week, and we got hours upon hours of footage. This featured things like surprise features we didn't even really know about, some Hogwarts secrets, and even some of the concerns that some of these previewers did have. But look, I realize that most of you out there probably don't have the free time to be able to watch a full day's worth of previews, so to help you out with that, I did. I watched a day's worth of Hogwarts Legacy previews, and in this video I compiled the impressions and interesting feature reveals from about 30 different previews that were published. And I think this really gives us a better idea as to what people overall felt about Hogwarts Legacy. Not just an individual's opinions, but a bunch of people's opinions. You can see some of the major trends that appear as a result. And if you're interested in any of these original videos, I will have them linked down below. And believe me, some of the revelations are quite fun, like some of the different animals in the game, some of which you'll even be able to take care of and feed. And thanks to today's video sponsor, Nom Nom, we're going to make sure your dog is eating good also. Nom Nom is awesome. The way this is going to work is you go to their website, create a nice little profile around your dog and any potential goals you may have for them. Or hey, maybe your dog developed those goals for themselves. And shortly thereafter, you'll have your dog's new meal plan delivered right to your door, specially created with your dog and their goals in mind. And all of the recipes will be researched by board-certified veterinary nutritionist. And let me tell you, my dog was excited. So excited to the point where as I was getting ready to film this video originally, she actually broke into the Nom Nom box and ate nearly all of her meals, even going as far as to hide some in her bed for later. If that's not a testament to quality food, I don't really know what is. Thankfully, Nom Nom was kind enough to send over a second box, which Heidi continued to love. She was specifically given some turkey fare, which had the perfect balance of protein, but also plenty of veggies like spinach and carrots. And for me, Nom Nom is incredibly convenient and completely removes the headache of making sure my dog is well fed. And since you watched this video, you're actually in luck. You can treat your dog to food that's good for them and good for their health, and you'll get 50% off your first order of Nom Nom just by clicking on that link down below or by going to trynom.com/JuiceHead. One of the first things that is always super interesting with media events like this are what restrictions are there? Because at times, the restrictions on a media event, what you can or can't do with the game, can be incredibly telling and illuminating over what devs don't want you to see. The Hogwarts Legacy preview event happened all over the world. There was events in LA and London, and influencers were flown out and given some experiences in addition to be able to play the game for about 2 hours. And one of the pretty interesting aspects of this is some of what was done here, some of that 2-hour play session is still covered by an NDA. On YouTube, we're only getting part of that 2 hours of gameplay, and certain things like story aspects are still embargoed. The preview event overall was done on PS5s using a non-release build version of Hogwarts Legacy, so this is an early build of the game. It'll get future updates after it, but also basically every single preview was done on a PS5 with Hogwarts Legacy running in performance mode, which means you're going to have a lower visual fidelity in performance mode, but also a locked 60 FPS, or at least hopefully a locked 60 FPS. 90% of the previews out there are going to be on performance mode on a PS5, except for one, for some reason. Game Riot is the only preview I found thus far that actually played the game at 30 FPS in the fidelity mode with some more graphical features enabled. I don't know how Game Riot managed this, but later in the video I will do some comparisons between the fidelity and the performance mode. But what the previews were actually shown or what they were allowed to see was also pretty interesting, as this preview event was fairly restrictive and actually broken up into a couple of different parts. Everyone got to create their own character in the traditional character creator that will be in the full game. And it seems like after the character creation finished, they actually played a bit more, but that part couldn't be recorded and they can't talk about it. Every character that was created had to be in House Gryffindor for one reason or another. Outside of the character creation, they were placed right outside of Hogwarts at a low level. This was their created character, but it wasn't the immediate start of the game. Some events happened before this, it's just very early into the game, not actually where you start at Hogwarts. And from there, they had about 10 minutes of exploration outside of Hogwarts, and then you could tell in many of the gameplays they were directed to go inside of Hogwarts. And during this outdoor segment, they had to stay near Hogwarts. A bunch of previewers talked about how they weren't actually able to explore the surrounding regions, just really the school and the grounds itself. But after that 10 minutes, they were able to go inside of Hogwarts, and this too was pretty restricted. You could even notice this from the gameplay, but some of the previewers described how they were kind of told to stay in a certain area, they weren't supposed to go in certain rooms, or if they went a direction they're not supposed to, the dev sitting behind them told them to go a different direction. It's honestly kind of hard to gauge how restrictive this was. We just know there were some restrictions, some rooms that were off limits, and in general there wasn't freeform interior exploration of Hogwarts during this, at least not completely freeform. And the last element of the preview that was posted online is when they were dispatched on a mission with Poppy Sweet Sweden. This was a relatively large time jump. You went from very early into the game where you're just level 3 or 4 to all the way level 19 and about 10 to 15 hours into the game. And that's a good summation of the general restrictions during the preview event. Outside of that, they couldn't actually access or show off any of the menus, they couldn't talk about the story or the map, and I think the limits in Hogwarts around themselves are the interesting ones. I do understand not wanting to share spoilers, but it's the whole not being able to walk around Hogwarts freely that gets me. Initially, when I was watching these previews, I kind of just thought they were thrown into Hogwarts at the castle and we're like, alright, do whatever you want. The reality that it wasn't quite like that is just interesting. It's not inherently a bad thing or inherently a good thing, but there were some previewers that definitely voiced disappointment in how restricted they actually were in the gameplay. But then, looking at the world itself, we start to get some of the most positive feedback of the event. While outside Hogwarts, nearly everyone took to Broomflight to explore around. And Broomflight in Hogwarts Legacy was described as being quite freeform. You can largely go wherever you want on the broom. It seems like you're able to do this from a relatively early point in the game. Many of these characters were just level 4 and able to fly around freely on their own broom. Quite a few of the previews described how controlling the broom at first was a bit clunky or they struggled with it. It seems like the Broomflight controls are inverted compared to how flying works in many other games. And at least during the preview, they couldn't access the settings menu to see if they could change that. But after some practice, almost everyone actually loved this feature. Even those that found it clunky or difficult at first ended up actually really enjoying the Broomflight, and some people even had a very high praise, saying this is one of the most exciting things about the game from this experience. A lot of other people actually praising the feel and sounds when flying. Being able to hear that wind moving past you. There are some limitations here though. You can't land the broom wherever you want. There's no landing on the castle roof and you have to be relatively close to the ground to get off the broom. But the process of landing is super quick and almost seamless. This also got a ton of praise. Whether it be jumping onto the broom or getting off of it, you can do it very quickly from the menu, and you could even summon your broom while halfway in the water to get out of swimming if you don't want to deal with that. And speaking of, yes, swimming is in Hogwarts Legacy. You're not able to dive underwater, but you can swim at a surface level, and if you go into deep water, you'll even wade through it with a custom animation. During the preview event, some people described also being able to fly on mounts, but they couldn't record gameplay of that, and Broomflight was described as being fast and agile, almost like a motorcycle where flying mounts was far more gradual and consistent. And one of the pretty cool features that seems to be there regardless of what you're flying on is you're able to look around while flying. In other words, the direction you're flying in is not tied to which direction you're looking. So you can fly straight while looking at all of the scenery as you pass by. The students you actually encounter and see around Hogwarts got far more mixed reactions, although still quite a fair few in the positive column. You can watch other students react to magical artifacts. They'll do things like walk on walls, there'll be steam coming out of their ears from eating something really hot, and even just some more miscellaneous interactions that happen, like students getting yelled at by professors. You could also find students practicing Quidditch. We know Quidditch isn't in the game, we can't actually play it for ourselves, and we hear in this preview that the lore reason for that is Headmaster Black canceled Quidditch at Hogwarts. And some students are quite unhappy about that. And some of the other comments made by students aren't completely random. There are references to past in-game events taken by the character, like us being a troll slayer at Hogsmeade, or even one character describes how they met us in a common room previously. This seems to imply that there's going to be at least some custom dialogue based on which house we choose, because it's implied that you can only access the Gryffindor common room because we are of House Gryffindor, or maybe not actually. Since writing this part of the video, a further interview has come out from the devs where they mention that you can actually visit other common rooms even beyond your own house. It's not clear how extensive that visit will be, but apparently that's a thing, at least somewhat. Although even beyond that, just looking at these students overall, it was described how there really was a healthy amount of students all over the place at Hogwarts. And although things are very active during the day, once it turns to nighttime, things do really clear out. But the students at Hogwarts were not issue-free, as some of these students looked a little bit too familiar. Many previewers reported that while they were playing the game, they would see students that had the exact same player model. At times, these two students would be standing right next to each other and be identical twins. Of course, they weren't actually identical twins, at least I don't think so. Instead, it seems like there's just a fixed number of students that can be generated, and sometimes it has to generate the same student twice. And sometimes those students happen to be walking around near each other. Hogwarts Legacy also has a random encounter-like system. Sometimes when running throughout the castle, there's going to be a scripted event that can occur based on your location. The one everyone's pointing out is the poltergeist popping out and messing with a student. But also just in general, things around the castle are always moving. You can find busts following you, pictures in motion, and sometimes things even reacting to your actions. There are a variety of cats at Hogwarts, and you are able to pet the cat. Or if you hate cats, some people even tried using spells on them. You cannot kill the cat completely, but you are able to slightly incapacitate it, and then it will run off quickly. Many of the previews described having these wonder moments. The castle feels alive and like its own character with an immense amount of things to discover and just a ton of detail in it throughout. This partially being as a result of the students getting up to all kinds of random student things, but separately, just the physical castle itself had a lot of moments where it really felt like it was a character. And even though we talked about how some of these previews were limited in where they could go within Hogwarts, nobody specifically mentioned this as an issue, and instead, many actually described how Hogwarts felt absolutely massive even with some of the restrictions in place as to where they could explore. One pretty interesting observation I had was a lot of the previewers felt like how alive Hogwarts felt was a super big positive for the game, with some even calling it the most impressive thing they saw throughout the entire preview. A lot of viewers and fans online who have consumed and watched a bunch of this gameplay felt a bit different. There were far more frustrations from fans over the NPCs they saw in the gameplay, whether that be lackluster facial animations, a lack of proper schedules for those NPCs, or even just a general lack of interaction with a lot of the NPCs. Like, yeah, they'd be doing things on their own, but you couldn't really do much with them. Like one simple example being that you could use spells in the castle, and a lot of the NPCs wouldn't even react to you doing this. And I found this interesting because that was a pretty common complaint from people that were watching this gameplay that was released, but it wasn't a common complaint among the people who actually played the game. And this doesn't necessarily mean the previewers, the fans, are right or wrong, it's just an interesting observation overall. One thing that there will be tons of in Hogwarts though are puzzles or challenges. There's going to be a ton of things that are revealed to you simply by casting the Revelio spell. You can see chests through walls and much more. There's constantly going to be things on your minimap for you to look into, such as this mini quest or the short little puzzle that basically everyone did. Use Lumos to solve the puzzle. And one of the interesting observations of this is, as you're solving this puzzle, you actually did get a clear marker and direction on your minimap. So it would direct you where to go next, or at least the general area to go next for solving this puzzle. And once you followed the markers, it would give you a general area to look through, but it was relatively small. And some people described how having their hand be held this much on a puzzle was a bit frustrating. It was a little bit too easy, and it would have been more fun to just explore yourself. Although we do know from past dev comments, you are able to turn off the minimap if you want to, which would obviously make this a lot more difficult. Although outside of just the puzzles, this game was also described as a full looter's paradise. You're able to loot things like gear, currency, and more from all over the place. Sometimes this would come from fallen enemies that you took out in combat, other times it would be from chests, as well as there's going to be tiers of loot here. You could find legendary loot or lower level loot, as well as loot that is either identified or not. In Hogwarts Legacy, only some of the loot you find will be identified where you could see its description and its effects. We couldn't actually see this menu because, of course, we're not allowed to see the menus from the game yet. But the way it'll work is if you find unidentified loot, you could see which rarity it was and what type of item it was. But in order to find out its actual abilities and appearance, you would have to take it back to the room of requirement and the identification station and highlight it. And it wasn't really clear what made loot drop as identified versus unidentified. I'm sure there's some talents or other skills tied to this, but in general, there was a mix. There were not many minigames shown off during this gameplay. It seems like Summoner's Court was the one everyone played. It's almost like curling, where you have to use a spell to pull a ball into a certain range, and the better you get it in those ranges, the more points you get. You're going to be playing against somebody else, and it was described as being a ton of fun. But again, the only minigame that was really shown off during this preview, even though the game hopefully has more than this. The Floo Flame fast travel points are very generous in Hogwarts. This is the fast travel system in the game, and apparently they are all over the castle, and this is done deliberately. The castle apparently is quite large and you get lost, but using these as a marker is quite handy. And one of the other things that wasn't mentioned all that much throughout the previews overall, but when it was mentioned got a ton of praise, was the music and sound design. Several of the previewers felt the music and sound added a ton to the experience. and it really made them feel immersed in the world. Some people describe this as one of their favorite things overall. I wouldn't be shocked if a big part of this is whether or not you grew up watching Harry Potter films, how much nostalgia you have attached to some of those sounds, but it seems like if you did grow up with Harry Potter, the sound effects this game has are really going to be something special for you. And different parts of the castle will even feature their own distinct music tracks that play as you go in them. Performance was a bit of an interesting one throughout this preview. Like I mentioned earlier, everyone was playing on a PS5 and almost everyone was playing on performance mode. And in general, almost nobody complained about the FPS. It does not seem like there was much in the way of FPS drops at all, and on performance mode, it was very consistently sticking to that 60 FPS. Granted, we only saw a small slice of the game, and you would think Hogwarts would be one of the first things to be optimized, but either way, things look good. But two issues did arise. That was with pop-in and loading doors. Pop-in, particularly when outside flying on a broom, was quite noticeable at points, just seeing things pop in and appear in the distance. But a bit more concerning were some of the loading screens on doors. This was one of the most prevalent complaints from the previews overall. Basically, as you run up to a door in Hogwarts, instead of being able to just walk through it, a little loading symbol will pop up and you'll have to wait for a couple of seconds before you're actually able to push through that door. Now, I wouldn't be that concerned for this on PS5. Even when it did appear, it was really short, and I wouldn't be shocked if the PC version of the game barely has this problem at all. And again, we still have the day one patch. But where I am concerned for this is when you consider that this game's also coming to the PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. If you are somebody who is looking forward to playing Hogwarts Legacy on one of those systems, this would be a pretty big red flag to me. The PS5 is leaps and bounds ahead of those other consoles in terms of performance, and if this is having problems actually loading the entire castle, at least doing it in a seamless way, you have to imagine the PS4 is going to be chugging, and really the Nintendo Switch in particular might have some more large issues. But then we also have this Game Riot gameplay. Again, this is the only outlet I could find that actually played on the fidelity mode instead of performance. This locked the game to 30 FPS, but gave them better visuals overall. In some of the scenes comparing fidelity and performance, you can really see the difference. The lighting in particular on fidelity is just way better. The shadows are far more drawn out on the little blocks in the distance, and even in the background of this shot, you can see a greater degree of vibrance from the lighting in fidelity mode. I'll have a link to this gameplay specifically highlighted down below if you really want to see fidelity mode. But I would say overall, almost all of the previews were quite happy with how the game looked, outside of some of the pop-in issues and the occasional stiff face. The environments, the castle itself, and just flying around got a ton of praise from a visual perspective. But that brings us to questing, and where this preview started with the character creator. The character creator was described as being quite inclusive, with a healthy amount of options and customizability. And really, it just seems like it's fine. Most of the options you want are there, with there really being three major issues with the character creator. There is no height or weight option, so you'll always be this fairly fit young adult / child, as well as there is some weirdness with the voice pitch. You do have voice pitch options, but a lot of the previewers described how it just kind of sounded odd or off, or like this could be bugged.
It was wonderful. I believe I'm really going to enjoy this class.
I'm eager to get to Hogsmeade.
I am indeed a student.
That was cool. It was wonderful. I believe I'm really going to enjoy this class.
A few cobwebs and some dust.
I am indeed a student, but I could very well be able to help.
One surprise feature that was discovered but couldn't be fully shown off is this game's going to feature a full transmog system. So you're able to have gear that you use these stats from, but then separately have a different outfit or different clothing that will override that other gear visually. So you do have a large degree of freedom to dress your character however you want them to be, regardless of stats. And this is actually pretty accessible. You're able to do this at any point you want just from the gear menu, which is always on your main menu. No having to deal with crafting tables or anything like that. During the preview, there was some quest content shown off that is still embargoed. But on that front, we got some loose or high-level details. Many people described how it felt like they were experiencing a new story in the wizarding world, and how the story will really hook you in from the start of the game. And early in the game, there will be several in-game events that will push the story forward. When you track a quest, a golden trail will appear ahead of you to direct you towards that quest location, and there's even going to be some notes scattered throughout Hogwarts that you could find to get further lore details from. Some general questions were answered on quests during this event. Reportedly, the game will feature about 150 quests and 100 side quests in total. The length of the game is estimated to be around 40 hours for just the main story and 100 hours for a more completionist playthrough, although that's going to heavily depend on your playstyle. In a separate interview, we heard from the game director how it took him about 80 hours for a completionist run, but of course he's incredibly knowledgeable about the game, and reportedly if you're not careful, you're able to miss side quests if you just stick to the main story. Like after a certain progression point in the main story, side content will no longer be available, as well as new side quests will pop up after completing main story quests, so it seems like some of these side quests in the game will be dependent on main story events. And one of the interesting insights we got into questing from this event was how dialogue will actually change. Almost everyone who went to the preview did this puzzle. There's going to be a student that brings up that they can't figure out how to solve this puzzle, so then we have the opportunity to solve it. After we solve it, we can return to the student and have a couple of dialogue options as to how to proceed. You can tell them the solution, or alternatively just be a jerk to them and not actually tell them the solution. And apparently, if you do this across the game, students will talk about you in a different way as a result. So if you're mean to other students, it seems like you'll almost develop a reputation for that and they'll speak about you differently. The big piece of quest content was the Poppy Sweeting quest. And there's definitely some confusion around what this is and isn't. A lot of the previews mentioned how this was a main story quest, but it seems like that isn't actually true. In reality, this is going to be a completely optional side quest you can do in the game. And really, it's a pretty simple quest in concept. We're taking out some poachers with Poppy Sweeting, who is going to be one of the available companions in the game. And during this quest, there's going to be a stealth segment where you can start to see some of the first stealth gameplay in Hogwarts Legacy. The game features a fairly simple stealth system overall. You're able to go invisible using a spell. And from there, you're able to sneak around and take down some of the poachers. One thing lots of people liked was as you're invisible, your character and companion will whisper, including even some of those spell commands as you use them will be whispered.
I know you're there, Trumpus Totalis.
But also, we just got confirmation that there's only going to be one stealth spell you can use. So the spell you see as we're paralyzing each enemy is the only stealth spell in the game. If you try and use any other spells, it'll actually break stealth. But there are definitely some oddities with this gameplay as well. When you take an enemy in stealth, their body will disappear after 30 seconds, so there's no hiding body gameplay element. And the NPC intelligence overall wasn't exactly praised. We could see another NPC react to his pal being taken out, but since the player is invisible, they just move on relatively quickly. Several of the previewers felt this invisibility spell was a little bit too overpowered. You were a little bit too free to just wander around in front of enemies while this was active. Although there also are different ways to go invisible. We know we have this spell, which we saw in the gameplay, but separately there is a potion you can use to go invisible. It's not really clear if one will perhaps be a higher degree of invisibility than the other. And as you can see in the gameplay, enemies will feature a pretty familiar alert system. You simply follow the meter above their head and you back away as it starts to fill up. One of the biggest criticisms of this quest overall was how restrictive it actually was. You're not able to abandon Poppy during this mission. If you wander too far away from her, a prompt will come up that will tell you to go back near her with a 10-second countdown. And this was fairly restrictive. Like, you couldn't really walk that far away from Poppy, and if she continued walking away from you, this could also trigger the prompt. This was only during this quest. It was the only quest we really properly saw during the gameplay. And even outside of that, nobody was really impressed with the degree of choice or consequence we had during this. This was just a side quest, so perhaps it'll be a bit different during the main quest. But overall, the quest was fairly linear. There weren't many choices or different outcomes. The only real choice was how you approach some of the combat encounters, whether you want to go stealthy or if you want to go full wands blazing. And from this preview event in general, this is definitely one of the unanswered questions. How much choice and consequence is there actually in Hogwarts Legacy? We still don't really know. But then that brings us to the single most disliked thing in the preview of Hogwarts Legacy, which is this lockpicking minigame, which you can do on this quest. Out of all of the previews I watched, only one person mentioned actually liking this minigame after they figured it out. And for many, this was like their negative thing that they highlighted in the negative sections of their video. But basically in Hogwarts Legacy, there's going to be locks that you'll have to pick, and you'll have to use a spell to kick off a lock-picking minigame. Lots of players had a dev guiding them through this that was sitting right behind them, and they were still struggling with figuring it out. And even just as a broader criticism, a lot of people felt it was out of place. Like, why are you using a spell to open a lock, but that doesn't actually open the lock? You use a spell to kick off a minigame where then you have to figure out how to open the lock. lock. It was described as a rather big departure from the typical fun gameplay, although one thing we did learn is these locks don't get more difficult as the game goes on. Unlike other games like Skyrim or Fallout, they will always be at this difficulty level. There's going to be higher tier locks, but it just means you need a higher tier talent to be able to open them or access them. And at a different point in the gameplay, we could see a level 1 lock that is within Hogwarts, and we can't actually open this because we lack the requisite talent. But this lock was holding something pretty interesting, as inside of this cage, we do recover a dragon egg. You get to keep this at the end of the quest, and it seems like this is a heavy implication that dragon pets could be an aspect of this game, or perhaps even a dragon mount. One of the other things a lot of people noticed was the amount of challenges that you complete. There's going to be challenges for your relationship with other characters, defeating certain types of enemies, or even just finding things in the world. So it seems like there's quite a few things that are constantly tracked in Hogwarts Legacy, and you'll get rewards for doing them. Not much is known about how the talent system will work, and the latest batch of previews don't really illuminate any more on that, but at the very least, challenges are a pretty big part and a pretty active part of this game. But then that brings us into what has thankfully been one of the most well-received aspects of Hogwarts Legacy thus far from the preview, the combat. But I think there are some people out there getting a bit confused as to the combat gameplay and really the intensity of some of the combat gameplay. During the early level gameplay around Hogwarts, the previewers did a combat tutorial on some of the basic spell combos. This is pretty simple stuff like the tutorial will probably do when we play the game at a very early level, and that was their initial foray into the combat of Hogwarts Legacy, but then it's going to cut to this Poppy Sweeting quest, which is quite the jump. This is actually about 15 hours into the game. We can see the character is level 19 here. We know the max level in Hogwarts Legacy is level 40. So as we watch this arena gameplay, I think it's important to note that this is really a mid-game battle that is being played by people who just got their hands on this game like 40 minutes beforehand. Yet even despite that, many of the previews absolutely loved the combat in Hogwarts Legacy. Combat was described as something that will likely be pretty difficult to master in this game. There's a ton of depth here, and although it takes some time to learn it, once you do, it was described as a ton of fun. Many people felt like this battle was hectic with a lot happening all at once, but overwhelmingly enjoyable. Combat was described as fresh and unlike any other game most of the previewers have played before. And one of the big points that actually got quite a bit of praise from multiple previews was the light lock-on mechanics. And that is to say that the game wasn't heavy-handed with you locking onto enemies. A lot of the spellcasting involves you manually pointing towards enemies and then casting your spell in their direction. There is a lock-on system in Hogwarts Legacy, so you could target certain enemies at a given time, but compared to some of the other games out there, this is much lighter, and a lot of the combat is you genuinely aiming, and many even described it as frantically switching from target to target. And if you're sitting here kind of wondering, okay, well, why are people praising the lack of a lock-on mechanic or a lack of a heavy-handed lock-on mechanic? A lot of people, I think, watching some of the gameplay put out by devs thought there would be a component where you could kind of just spam a key, almost like a VATS key, and the game would just auto-aim you from enemy to enemy, and that's really how the combat and spellcasting would work. But when previewers got their hands on the game, they discovered this was very much so not the case. When you see crazy moves, crazy turning, and going from enemy to enemy with these different spells and attacks, that's you actually doing it, at least to a large degree. It does seem like when you're very close to an enemy, it'll lock on, but otherwise it's a lot of freeform movement and very flowy combat. And the combat was described as challenging, but very enjoyable, even for experienced RPG players. And overall, it seems like combat in Hogwarts Legacy is something that will take a while to master, but is still fairly approachable. Even after just a couple of hours in the game, many felt like they got the hang of it, or at least for the most part. And some of the praise of the combat in Hogwarts Legacy was incredibly high, mentioning how this was the first Harry Potter game to really get the feel of spells and their physics correct. Nearly all of the previews you see are on the normal difficulty for this playthrough. There are a couple that put it on easy, but for the vast majority it seems like it was normal. I know though there's a fair amount of intricacies as far as getting the hang of combat and getting all of your spells off correctly. Most players never died during this unless they let their character die to test something, mentioning how the health potions were really a get out of jail free card. And basically everyone was able to get the hang of the combat with two notable outliers, which just so happened to be two very large gaming news outlets. So like, yeah, there's this meme that journalists at very large gaming outlets just aren't very good at video games. And I'm not trying to sit here and contribute to that stereotype, but my god, what are these people doing? One larger outlet in particular has gameplay of them just getting stunned over and over again with no attempts at dodging or shielding or any other type of counteraction. This goes on for a while, where you just kind of watch them floating in the air periodically because they are just never blocking the stun attack. And funny enough, as I have now watched 10 more videos since finding that last one, the only other preview I saw have this much combat difficulty was another large gaming outlet. Either way, this gameplay does provide a nice opportunity to give you some more insight into combat. As you are stunned in Hogwarts Legacy, you're going to float into the air and kind of writher around, but you'll notice that a button will appear on screen as this does happen. Well, which button appears on screen as you are stunned will change, and as you can imagine, the way this will work is, as you are stunned, you hit that button that pops up in a little circle and it'll break your stun if you hit it quickly enough. But if you hit the wrong button or take too long to hit the button, like we could see in this gameplay, very conveniently provided by some major gaming outlets, you're going to remain stunned for even longer and further attacks will come and hit you. There's also this really nice indicator as to when an attack is coming. You have this charm above your head. It's your cue to press the triangle key to shield yourself or use a dodge. And we found out from this preview, if an incoming attack is unblockable and you have to dodge it, it'll be a red charm on your head. But this charm is also a big cue as to how to time your parries. The little charm will actually shrink in size as the spell is getting closer to hitting you. And if you use your parry right at the perfect time when the charm is at its thinnest, this will trigger a counter attack where you'll block the incoming attack but then also immediately fire back on the enemy caster. In the gameplay, we've also seen these colored shields. To break the colored shield, you have to use the same color of spell and it'll pierce through it. Or another pretty cool mechanic is you can use your ancient magic to throw a world object and that will always break the shield. So yeah, when you see people throwing environmental objects, that's not really a specific spell, it's just an inherent ancient magic ability our character will have. There's one instance of combat leading to environmental destruction that a lot of the previews highlighted. You throw something at this bridge, the bridge explodes, and later on you could use a spell to fix it, which a lot of people really loved that gameplay moment. The death screen in Hogwarts Legacy is going to be your journey has ended with choices to try again or just abandon the quest. A few of the gameplays gave us a really nice view of some of the spells in Hogwarts Legacy. We could see the 23 slottable spells here, as well as the 6 essential spells down at the side. Those essential spells are what is triggered when you hit the triangle key. It's kind of like your counter or defensive measure. Although we can't actually see the menu being interacted with, it was described that when you highlight one of these spells, a little video will pop up showing what exactly it does. And something I found interesting from this preview was, as we go to that Poppy Sweden quest, we know this is about 15 hours into the game, we're about halfway to the max level, and we still have quite a few spells locked. 10 of the 23 spells are locked on our character. Now this could just be due to how the character was made with the jumping ahead during the gameplay preview. Obviously the previewers didn't play 15 hours, so they had to skip ahead somehow. But otherwise, this could be an indication that we don't get access to all of the spells until late game. 3 of the locked spells are the unforgivable spells, which are those dark green ones, which is a bit more understanding. But even beyond that, you're halfway into the game, but still half of the available spells are locked for you, which is definitely interesting. And also during this gameplay, we could see an epic fire tornado. Not much explanation on how this came to be, but it looks really cool. And one of the other big takeaways from this gameplay was how not childish it was, and really into how dark Hogwarts Legacy could be at times. There's a scene with a stag being brutally dragged into a river and getting eaten.
That's the third time I've seen a Dugbog behave that violently.
Some of the spells, especially when you're using ancient magic, can get quite violent and gruesome, making people literally explode. Especially when you frame this as, okay, you're a teenager who just got to a magic school and now you're literally causing enemies to explode or get smacked into the ground. But even from this preview, we could see there are going to be some limits on how evil you can be. You're not able to attack other students freely within Hogwarts. And in general, this is going to be a game where you have a button you're going to spam, that being the Revelio spell. This is going to reveal chests, quest items, and even highlight enemies around you. And when you highlight an enemy using this spell, they will remain highlighted so you can kind of track them through walls. And overall, I found the Hogwarts Legacy previews to be pretty interesting. One of the things I was most curious about was combat, and people across the board seem to have absolutely loved the combat in this game. It seems like this may end up being one of the big standout features, and really what gets people coming back for subsequent playthroughs to try out different builds or different play styles. And Hogwarts Castle also saw a ton of praise as being genuinely interesting and an interactive castle that you will want to spend a ton of time in. But at the same time, the game definitely isn't perfect. Some of the restrictions at this event were definitely raising some red flags for me. The fact that the previewers weren't able to just explore Hogwarts freely was just curious to me. This is a game that is going to be playable in 3 weeks from when this footage was recorded. I do understand not wanting to spoil too much of Hogwarts and the castle, but at the same time, you're at a super early level with an almost final build of the game. I know though, issues like the pop-in or even some of the load screens on the doors don't concern me too much if you're playing playing on next gen or PC. If I was somebody who was looking forward to playing this game on an Xbox One or a PS4, this would be a big concern to me because I would say there's a high degree of certainty you'll experience this when you play. In particular, if you're on a Nintendo Switch, I don't see how you don't have load screen problems on a Nintendo Switch if you're having them on a PS5. And I feel like one of the other things about this preview that is interesting is there's a lot of questions it just didn't answer. We still know basically nothing about the talent system in the game. We know very little about how much of an impact our house will have on our experience overall. Will it really have much of any impact? And even just how much choice and consequence there are during some of the major quest lines. It seems like we're going to have to wait for full reviews to really get answers on those questions, but either way, from what I saw, I am definitely excited. It seems like those core features of an interesting and dynamic spell and combat system, as well as a massive living castle, are really being delivered on. It seems like people are really impressed with that, and frankly, that's what I'm excited to experience, so it gets me even more excited for Hogwarts Legacy. And if you want to keep more up to date with this game, you can get subscribed, but until next time, thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see you all later.